Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping in for, I think, one of the most persistent, chilling, and scientifically complex mysteries of the entire 20th century.
For sure. It's one of those stories that just sticks with you.
It really does. We're talking about the Dyatlov Pass Incident. It's a story that has, it's consumed researchers, it's fueled countless conspiracy theories, and it has just defied any simple explanation for well over 6 decades now.
That's right.
So just to set the stage for you, it's 1959. 9 highly trained Soviet student hikers set off into the northern Urals. When they fail to return, searchers are eventually led to the slopes of a mountain called Kholat-Syakhl.
And that name itself is pretty ominous.
It is. The indigenous Mansi people gave it that name. And
Yeah.
it roughly translates to Dead Mountain or Silent Peak.
Yeah, not exactly a welcoming sign.
Not at all. And what the searchers found there, it's just truly horrifying. The group's tent, it's discovered slashed open from the inside.
From the inside, that's the first huge question mark.
Exactly. Their bodies were scattered all across this freezing landscape, some of them nearly naked, some exhibiting these catastrophic blunt force internal injuries. And then to add this final, just bizarre layer of intrigue, some of the clothing they recovered was contaminated with trace amounts of radiation.
It's just a stack of questions, one on top of the other.
It is. Okay, so let's unpack this. We've pulled together a really comprehensive stack of sources for this deep dive. We've got the intimate group diaries. We have the cold, hard facts of the original Soviet autopsy reports, the official crime scene photos, and I think critically, this stunning 2021 scientific reconstruction that uses modern physics models. Our mission today is focused. We are going to try and move past the decades of sensational theories, UFOs, secret weapons, military cover-ups, and really isolate the coherent, tragic narrative of what truly happened on that fatal night of February 1st, 1959. We want to know not just what happened, but how and why it created this unique pattern of death.
That's right. And the raw sources we have are so compelling because they weave together this deeply intimate human material. The diaries show you their laughter, their planning, their frustration with frozen boots,
Right.
with the objective, indifferent reality of forensic pathology and, snow mechanics. We are forced to juxtapose this internal world of these incredibly resilient hikers against the external brutal indifference of the Arctic environment.
It's that contrast that makes it so compelling.
It is. And by synthesizing this material, we can finally understand how a single geographical and sort of timing error turned an ambitious Category 3rd certification hike into a perfectly fatal storm relying solely on the laws of physics.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Part 1, setting the stage and meeting the crew.
Right. To start, you really have to appreciate the geography and just the sheer isolation of this location. The Ural Mountains are often called the ancient spine of the continent. They're this vast low-lying range that divides Europe and Asia.
And we are specifically in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. In 1959, this was the frontier.
It was absolutely the unforgiving frontier.
So the site itself, the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, it's not actually that high by global standards. It's only about, 1,096 meters?
Yeah.
Barely 3,600 feet. So why is a mountain that's relatively small so incredibly dangerous?
Well, the danger is subtle, but it's profound, and it is entirely defined by one thing: exposure. The terrain is made up of these rolling, exposed shoulders, or goltzy, that are directly in the path of these powerful Arctic fronts that sweep down completely unobstructed from the Karasea.
Okay, so there's nothing to stop the wind.
Nothing. And when those fronts hit this specific geography, the land acts like a massive funnel. These features concentrate the wind into what are called katabatic winds. These are dense, freezing air masses that accelerate down the slope at gale or sometimes even hurricane force.
Oh.
So if you are caught on those treeless slopes, you are entirely at the mercy of the wind chill and the brutal, brutal cold.
So it's not the height of the mountain, it's the sheer force and the constant nature of that wind.
Precisely. And the sources confirm that the indigenous Mansi people who had hunted and traversed these ridges for centuries, they actively avoided Kholat-Syakhl during the harsh winter months.
And this wasn't superstition.
No, not at all. It's not some mystical terror, as some of the, more outlandish theories have suggested. It was seasoned, traditional knowledge rooted in practical experience. It was an acknowledgement of the simple lethality of that specific environment in February. The terrain just sets an incredibly high price for any navigational or camping mistakes.
Now let's turn to the hikers themselves.
Yeah.
We have to dispel this image of, casual college students on a weekend trip. This was the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And hiking was treated as a state-sponsored athletic discipline.
That's an absolutely critical piece of context. During the Khrushchev thaw, recreational sports were heavily promoted. They were seen as markers of fitness and national resilience. And the Dyatlov group members were not novices in any sense of the word. They were the elite of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, the UPI hiking club. All of them were highly experienced and already veterans of multiple winter treks.
And their ultimate objective, this Category 3 hike certification, is the key indicator of their expertise. What did that actually mean, Category 3?
It was the highest difficulty rating available at the time. To put it into perspective for you, this wasn't just a tough weekend. It was an undertaking that required covering at least 300 kilometers in severe, uncompromising winter conditions.
So 300 kilometers, that's nearly 200 miles.
Exactly. Navigating difficult terrain, demonstrating expert survival skills. This level of rigor required immense physical fitness, meticulous planning, and a ton of self-confidence.
Right, and that confidence is key.
It's key. When we analyze that final tragic decision, we have to understand it was made by highly competent, self-assured athletes, not by inexperienced kids. That's what makes the tragedy even more confounding. It wasn't due to poor packing or a lack of fitness. It was likely due to a geological miscalculation combined with maybe a little bit of overconfidence in their ability to manage a crisis.
The sources do such an excellent job of humanizing these victims, which is so important. It prevents us from just seeing them as names on some tragic roster. Let's start with the man who made that critical decision, the leader.
That would be Igor Dyatlov. He was 23, studying radio engineering. And he wasn't just a charismatic leader, he was an innovator. The sources highlight that he had designed and built a portable stove specifically for the tent, intended for use in the treeless highlands.
That's incredible.
It is. This custom piece of equipment was actually found later, and it just illustrates his meticulous planning for these extreme conditions.
That innovation is a bit of a double-edged sword, though, isn't it? I mean, it shows he was prepared for the cold, but his faith in that equipment, combined with his leadership ambition, seems to have led directly to that controversial decision to camp on the exposed slope around 5:00 p.m. on February 1st.
I think you're right. It was the ultimate calculated risk. They were running out of daylight, they were battling a fierce blizzard, and they had unintentionally climbed the eastern slope instead of crossing the pass.
So Dyatlov had a choice to make.
He had a choice. Retreat 1.5 kilometers back down to the forest edge in safety, losing the altitude and time they'd gained, or set up camp right there. His choice to stay suggests this immense confidence in his team's ability to endure.
Or maybe was he trying to simulate the conditions they'd face later?
That's a strong possibility. Maybe a desire to simulate the difficult, exposed conditions of the summit of Mount Matorton, their ultimate goal, for the sake of the certification. Tragically, that confidence was misplaced. Not in his team, but in his understanding of the geology of the snowpack.
And then there is Zenaida Kolmogorova. She was 22, the only woman besides Dubinina. The sources call her the soul of the group.
She really seems to have been the emotional anchor. Her diary entries give us this heartbreaking glimpse into her character. I mean, even while she's preparing for this incredibly grueling trek, her entries are filled with simple human concern. She paused to ask her family about domestic trivialities, like, has the cow calved yet?
Wow, it just grounds it in such reality.
It's a moment of profound empathy captured forever in the sources. And she was also physically resilient. She was later found further up the slope than the two men beside her, having fought longer against the cold in that final, desperate climb back toward the tent.
And Lyudmila Dubinina, the youngest woman at 20, she seems to have been defined by her intensity.
A very serious-minded engineering and economics student, sometimes nicknamed the disciplinarian or treasurer. Her physical toughness was already legendary within the UPI circles.
Right, there was that story about her being shot.
Yeah, she had completed a previous hike despite being accidentally shot in the leg by a hunter in 1958. Unbelievable.
She demonstrated this immense resilience, which makes the specifics of her eventual fate found in the ravine with catastrophic internal injuries all the more jarring. It's so indicative of the immense forces that were involved that night.
And we have to address Semyon Zolotaryov. He's the figure who most attracts the conspiracy theories. He was the oldest, 38, a World War II veteran, and he only joined the group at the last minute to get his Category 3 certification.
Zolotaryov is the enigma, definitely. His military background, the fact he occasionally used the names Alexander or Sasha, that only fueled all the speculation that he was, a KGB agent or a military observer.
But forensically, his body was key to understanding the survival struggle.
Absolutely key. He was found wearing a personal camera distinct from the group's shared equipment. and he was significantly better dressed than the others in the ravine. And this proves he was wearing clothes scavenged from the deceased members. It was a practical, desperate act of survival that occurred after the initial disaster. That one detail about the scavenging, it just speaks to this horrifying hierarchy of survival that played out on that slope.
It does. It really dictates the timeline. First, the disaster, then the struggle for life, then the grim necessity of scavenging the dead to provide just minimal protection for the living.
And we also have Rustam Slobodin, the stoic who carried his mandolin into the wilderness.
Right. And was later found with that non-fatal but definitely contributing skull fracture. And then the two Yuris, Doroshenko and Krivonyshenko, who died first at the cedar tree, just exhausting themselves trying to keep that small fire alive.
And of course, the sole survivor, Yuri Yudin.
Yuri Yudin, a 21-year-old geology student. He was the 10th member, but chronic sciatica forced him to turn back on January 28th. His survival, while a blessing for him, it clearly burdened him immensely for the rest of his life.
But from a historical standpoint, his departure is the only reason we have that initial context.
Exactly. The group's high spirits, the precise equipment they carried, and Dyatlov's slightly revised timeline for the return telegram. He preserves the context we need to even start the reconstruction.
Okay, let's move into part two, the trek, the decision, and the night of horror. The sources, especially the diaries, give us this wonderful sense of youthful energy before everything turned fatal.
Oh, absolutely. The initial days were pure high-energy chaos, typical of student trips. They depart Sverdlovsk on January 23rd. The diaries record them frantically shoving oatmeal into their backpacks, joking around and singing songs about everything from love and friendship to cancer, illness, and cures on this freezing GAZ-63 truck ride to Vizhai.
It sounds like any other trip with friends.
It does. It just confirms they were a unified, well-bonded team making light of the severe conditions.
And their planning was meticulous. On January 31st, they reached the edge of the highlands and performed this crucial, pragmatic act that later proved they had every intention of returning safely.
That was the building of the labaz, or the cache. This was a raised wooden platform where they stored extra equipment and heavy food, canned meat, sugar, even the mandolin.
So they were intentionally lightening their load for the final ascent.
Exactly. But they were ensuring they had provisions waiting for them upon their descent and return via the same route. This detail utterly dismisses any theory suggesting they were planning to desert or were trying to vanish intentionally. They were methodical. They were planning for success.
So sound preparation right through January 31st. February 1st is when the environmental conditions fundamentally shifted, and it all started with a late start.
A very late start. They moved out of the relative protection of the Ospia Valley and began climbing toward the pass. Crucially, meteorological data confirms a sharp shift. An Arctic front moved in rapidly, bringing gale-force winds and an increasing snowstorm that reduced visibility to near zero.
So they were suddenly fighting whiteout conditions and these fierce winds.
Absolutely, and this fierce weather led directly to the critical navigational error.
The one that put them on the wrong mountain slope.
Exactly. Blinded by the snow, they lost their precise bearing. Instead of traversing the pass, they deviated west and inadvertently climbed the eastern slope of Kholat Shakal. And this brings us right back to Dyatlov's 5:00 p.m. decision. He saw they were exposed, the weather was worsening, but he chose to dig in right there rather than retreat the 1.5 kilometers to the tree line.
And the final photos, they confirm the normalcy of the camp setup at that stage.
They do. We see photos of them cutting snow blocks and smiling. They were confident, maybe even enjoying the challenge.
There was no hint of panic at that point.
Not at all. They were cutting snow blocks to build up the tent walls and level the sleeping platform. And this is the most critical forensic chain of evidence. They settled for a cold dinner of ham and crackers, and then they changed into sleepwear, removing their heavy outer layers and boots to use them as pillows and insulation inside the double-walled canvas tent. They were in their most vulnerable state, semi-dressed and settling in for the night when disaster struck.
Okay, so this is the trigger.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because for decades, the initial trigger was pure speculation, which just allowed all this space for the wildest theories to grow. The historical paradox was simple. The group was inside a tent, and they suffered catastrophic injuries that suggested a massive external force.
Right, and historically, Soviet investigators dismissed the possibility of an avalanche because the slope angle, what was it, between 23 and 30 degrees, was deemed too shallow for a catastrophic slide. So why did the 2021 model fundamentally challenge that assumption?
That's the core insight of the 2021 Gom and Puzrin scientific model. The question wasn't if a traditional, mountain sweeping avalanche happened, because it didn't, but how a specific localized slab release could occur on that shallow pitch, triggered by their own actions.
So we have to understand the specific snow physics they used.
We do. They determined that the slope was comprised of two critical components. The foundation was a layer of snow crystals called depth hoar. Now, this forms when temperature gradients inside the snowpack cause water vapor to move and refreeze into these large, weak crystalline structures.
So it's like a really unstable base layer.
Think of it like a layer of structurally weak, granulated sugar sitting at the base of a dense cake. It provides zero shearing strength. It's just waiting to fail.
So the foundation was essentially rotten. What was resting on top of it?
Resting on that weak depth hoar foundation was a heavy, dense wind slab. Remember those powerful katabatic winds we talked about?
The ones funneling down the mountain?
Exactly. They continuously transport and compact new snow, creating an extremely heavy, rigid layer on top. This wind slab was the roof, or the bomb, above their tent, and it was slowly being loaded with more and more weight by the constant wind.
And the trigger itself wasn't some external force, but it was the hikers' own attempt to make themselves comfortable for the night.
That's it. When they used their tools to level the tent floor, they made a cut into the snowpack below the slab. Think of it as severing the support beam for that heavy roof. While they were working, they didn't trigger a slide immediately because the friction and the remaining bonds were still just strong enough to hold.
This is where the timing becomes absolutely essential for understanding the tragedy.
The timing is everything. The critical load was reached hours after they had gone to sleep. The constant, brutal, katabatic winds continued to deposit massive amounts of snow onto the unstable slab above the tent. This slow, continuous loading of snow eventually exceeded the internal friction of that weak depth hoar layer. And at some point, silently, in the middle of the night, the pressure threshold was reached.
So this wasn't a huge, dramatic event you'd see in a movie.
Not at all. It was a silent, localized collapse, a dense block of snow weighing tons that sheared off along the weak layer and slid down a mere few meters, slamming directly into the tent where they lay sleeping. It hit the central sleeping area like a massive, localized hydraulic press.
And this crushing impact is the only logical explanation that aligns with the most difficult forensic findings.
It is the perfect mechanical explanation. The crushing impact of that localized slab caused the massive blunt force internal injuries. The victims' bodies were compressed between this multi-ton block of snow and the rigid base of the tent, which was stabilized by their skis and packed snow.
And that explains the specific pattern of trauma.
It does. The massive chest fractures and catastrophic skull fractures found on Zolotaryov, Dubinina, and Thibaut Brignol, without any corresponding external wounds, cuts, or lacerations on their skin. A fist or a weapon leaves a mark. Massive distributed compression does not.
So, they were sleeping, the slab hits, instantly crushing several members and collapsing the central portion of the tent. They wake up to freezing darkness, crushing weight, the sound of cracking bone. The entrance, which was laced shut, is likely buried or obstructed. So what the slash?
They were trapped, and they were understandably terrified of a second larger slide. The entrance was under the weight of the snow and facing the impact zone. Someone, likely the uninjured Dyatlov, grabbed a knife and slashed the canvas from the inside to create an emergency exit.
And that detail, confirmed by the tent state, absolutely rules out the theory of an external attacker.
Completely. They were trying to get out, not keep someone out.
In that chaotic exodus, they left behind the one thing they needed to survive. Almost all their warm clothing, their boots, their tools, axes, saws, the stove, were inside or buried under the snow.
It was an emergency measured in seconds. They prioritized getting themselves and the severely injured out of the immediate crush zone. They scrambled out into the -25, -30 degrees Celsius blizzard, many of them wearing only socks or bare feet or light shirts. You have to remember the intense psychological shock of the silent collapse, compounded by the inability to see or breathe properly.
But the sources also make a crucial distinction that undermines the pure panic theories, like infrasound. They didn't scatter.
That is the counter-evidence that confirms a tactical, organized retreat. The footprints discovered later, even though they were walking in socks or bare feet, showed 8 or 9 sets of tracks moving in a relatively orderly group, heading down the slope toward the forest edge 1.5 kilometers away.
So they were sticking together.
They were sticking together. This movement pattern suggests they were supporting the severely injured and maintaining group cohesion. They were making a rational, tactical decision to seek shelter in the relative safety of the tree line, despite the extreme circumstances.
Okay, let's move to part 3. the search, the bodies, and the puzzling injuries. The search operation was delayed because of Dyatlov's initial confidence. He had extended the anticipated return date from February 12th to the 14th, so the initial alarm wasn't truly raised until around February 20th.
That delay is huge. It gave the mountain almost 3 weeks to cover the evidence, which complicated the initial investigation immediately. Volunteers from UPI were dispatched first, and then they were soon joined by military and militia teams.
What were the immediate key discoveries that they made?
Well, the first, most shocking discovery was on February 26th. A student named Mikhail Sherevin found the half-torn tent. It was covered in snow, but inside they found the boots, the money, the food, and the heavy outer coats.
Confirming they abandoned essential gear.
Yes, confirming an immediate desperate emergency had occurred. Sherevin even reported toasting the group's health with a flask he found inside, operating on this grim hope that they were still alive and just separated somewhere.
And then it gets worse.
The true scope of the tragedy emerged the very next day, February 27th. The first 2 bodies were found near the cedar tree. Then, on March 5th, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were found scattered higher up on the slope. But the full, horrific picture didn't emerge until the snow melted weeks later. It took until May 4th to find the final 4 bodies deep in the ravine, buried under 4 meters of snow.
Let's focus on that initial discovery at the cedar tree scene. This is where the sheer desperation of their survival struggle is most apparent.
It's just brutal. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found at the base of a large Siberian cedar near the remains of a small, desperate fire. They were virtually stripped down to their underwear. Well, the forensic details speak to pure terminal agony. Their hands were badly burned and skin was torn off, suggesting they had climbed the cedar, possibly to get dry branches from high up for the fire, or perhaps they were just hoping to get a vantage point to see the tent 1.5 kilometers back up the slope.
And the detail regarding Krivonishenko, specifically, paints a picture of delirium caused by the extreme cold.
It does. He had bitten off a piece of his own knuckle, which is a rare but documented sign of terminal agony and delirium brought on by extreme hypothermia. They just completely exhausted their metabolic reserves trying to maintain that small fire. They sacrificed their own bodies, exposing themselves to the elements in an attempt to provide some light or heat for the larger group.
And this leads us into the grim process of scavenging, which confirms the timeline of death.
The clothing tells a powerful story of, well, loyalty and desperation. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko's clothes had been meticulously cut off or removed after they died. We know the survivors scavenged the dead to protect the living. Lyudmila Dubinina's foot, for instance, was found later wrapped in Krivonishenko's pants.
So they were using the garments of their fallen comrades.
Yes, and not necessarily for themselves, but likely to protect the most severely injured members who were later found in the ravine.
So moving up the slope, we find Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. They represent that final, heroic, and ultimately tragic decision.
They were found scattered between the cedar and the tent, and critically, all 3 were found pointing their heads uphill toward the tent. This was a suicidal final attempt to retrieve the gear that meant the difference between life and death. They knew they needed the axes, the boots, and the coats. They were crawling, fighting the elements, and they froze to death hundreds of meters from their objective.
Slobodin complicates the simple hypothermia narrative, though, because he was carrying a silent internal trauma.
He was. He had a 6-centimeter frontal skull fracture. The medical analysis suggested this blow possibly suffered during the initial slab impact, or maybe a bad fall on the ice during the chaotic descent. It wasn't instantly fatal, but it absolutely contributed to the rapid onset of hypothermia. It would have impaired his circulation, his judgment, his brain function. The depression found in the snow beneath him shows he fell while he was still warm, struggled against the ice as he froze, and succumbed to the cold hundreds of meters from safety.
And then the discovery of the final 4 bodies in May, after the snow melt. That completely changed the nature of the mystery, didn't it? It moved it decisively from exposure to a violent, crushing event.
It did. They were found deep in a ravine, 75 meters from the cedar, where they had dug a small snow den or shelter that subsequently collapsed on them.
They were covered by 4 meters of snow.
4 meters of snow and lying directly in a creek bed, which is vital context for the decomposition analysis. Now, for the most shocking findings. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had flail chest massive, asymmetrical chest fractures. This means they had 3 or more adjacent ribs fractured in 2 or more places, causing that segment to just detach from the rest of the rib cage.
So their chest walls were essentially detached. That requires an immense amount of force.
An immense amount. The medical examiner at the time specifically stated that the force required to inflict these injuries was equivalent to a car crash or the impact of a shockwave. Thibaut Bugnol had a catastrophic skull fracture that would have caused immediate unconsciousness and rapid death.
But again, the crucial point is that these were all severe internal crush injuries.
And yet there were no corresponding external wounds or bruises on the skin to suggest a fight, a fall from a height, or an attack with a blunt instrument. This points squarely back to massive distributed compression force, the snow slab.
And then we must address the most sensationalized detail of all, the missing soft tissue. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue and eyes, and Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. This is the detail that gave rise to every exotic theory, from military torture to Yeti attacks.
This is where forensic pathology provides a definitive, albeit gruesome, environmental explanation. We just have to remember where these bodies were found. Buried 4 meters deep, lying directly in a moving, freezing creek bed for 3 full months.
What happens to a body in that environment?
Soft tissue eyes, lips, and the tongue, which is easily accessed through the mouth, is the first to decompose or be scavenged. In a moving water environment, small aquatic life, crustaceans, fish, and even just simple water flow will rapidly remove and disintegrate soft, exposed tissue.
Especially the tongue.
Especially the tongue, which would have been slightly exposed if the victim died with their mouth open or suffered post-mortem degradation of the jaw muscles. The source evidence conclusively supports environmental decomposition and scavenging in the creek, and it completely rules out the need for exotic theories of torture or mutilation. It was the brutal indifference of nature, not the malicious intent of man.
Okay, that brings us to part 4. The slab avalanche theory provides a cohesive explanation for the trauma, the emergency exit, and the orderly retreat. But we cannot conduct a deep dive without fully addressing the elements that have kept this case alive for 65 years, starting with the bizarre finding of radiation.
The radiation traces are a classic red herring, entirely a product of the Cold War era. Traces of beta radiation were found on several garments, most notably the brown sweater worn by Dubinina, which, as we established, belonged to Krivonischenko, measuring up to 9,900 counts per minute, or CPM.
Okay, so what does 9,900 CPM actually mean in terms of exposure? Is that dangerous?
We need context for that. CPM, or counts per minute, measures the number of radioactive decay events detected by the Geiger counter per minute. The control soil sample at the scene measured 96 CPM, which is just normal background radiation.
So 9,900 CPM is definitely elevated.
It's elevated, but this level is still extremely low in terms of causing injury or death. To cause radiation sickness, you need doses exponentially higher and accumulated over a longer period of time.
So if it wasn't lethal, where did it come from?
The context is everything, and it points directly back to one of the victims. Yuri Krivonischenko worked as an engineer at the secretive Chelyabinsk 40 nuclear facility. This was the site of the 1957 Kyshtym disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in Soviet history. The entire facility and its employees were constantly exposed to low levels of residual radiation.
And the sources confirmed the radiation found on the clothing was washable.
Yes, and that specific detail, low-level, washable beta radiation is highly consistent with occupational cross-contamination. Krivonischenko's work clothes likely retained trace amounts of residual isotopes from his workplace, and these particles subsequently transferred to his outerwear and then to the clothes scavenged by the survivors.
So it rules out a local nuclear blast.
Completely. A blast would have left much higher, more lethal, and non-washable traces across the entire group, the tent, and the surrounding environment. It was merely an artifact of the atomic age they lived in, not the cause of their death.
Okay, moving on to the military theories. They persist, fueled primarily by the documented reports of glowing orange spheres seen in the night sky by witnesses and even some of the searchers around the time of the incident.
Again, we have to place this in the Cold War context. The late 1950s was the absolute peak of the Soviet missile program. These sightings were undoubtedly launches of the R-7 Semyorka intercontinental ballistic missile, the ICBM, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome.
But Baikonur is incredibly far away, over 2,000 kilometers from the northern Urals. How could they possibly see anything?
Distance doesn't negate visibility for high-altitude phenomena. We have records of R-7 test launches during this period, including one specifically confirmed on February 17, 1959, during the search operation. When these powerful ICBMs reach the upper atmosphere, the expansive rocket exhaust plumes reflect sunlight long after sunset, creating these spectacular, glowing, orange-yellow orbs or jellyfish shapes that are visible for thousands of kilometers.
So it was a coincidence of timing and location.
A very unfortunate coincidence. While startling, a rocket exhaust 2,000 kilometers away cannot cause a catastrophic skull fracture or flail chest trauma. They just chose to camp in the flight path's visibility window during a very tense period of Soviet history.
We should also briefly touch on the infrasound theory. It's a more sophisticated, attempted scientific explanation for the panic.
Right, the Kármán vortex street theory. It posits that the unique geometry of Kholat Shakal, acting like a dome, could have caused the gale force winds to generate extremely low-frequency sound infrasound.
And theoretically, this sound, which is below the threshold of human hearing, can induce intense feelings of panic, nausea, disorientation, even physical discomfort.
That's the theory.
It sounds like a neat explanation for why they might have cut the tent and fled in a panic. So why does the source material, specifically the forensic data, critique this theory so thoroughly?
Because it fails the physical evidence test on two major fronts. Firstly, while panic might explain the sudden exit, the footprints show the group retreated in a relatively orderly fashion, supporting the injured. Panic causes scattering, screaming, erratic movement. This is an organized attempt to reach shelter.
And the second point.
Secondly, and most definitively, infrasound is a low-energy phenomenon. It cannot cause a flail chest, massive internal bleeding, or fatal skull fractures. The physical trauma is crush damage. The infrasound theory is an over-engineered solution attempting to explain a behavioral detail, the flight, while completely ignoring the definitive physical evidence of a violent, localized impact.
Which brings us back with a deeper appreciation of the complexity to the scientific resolution. So part 5, the convergence of probabilities. The 2021 study didn't just propose the avalanche theory. It used highly detailed physics to prove its viability.
The study by Gom and Puzrin is foundational because it used advanced computational modeling of snow friction. They tackled that decades-old argument that the slope angle, 23 to 28 degrees, was too shallow. They proved that, under the exact combination of factors present that night, a catastrophic shallow slab release was inevitable.
They even used physics concepts related to animation, right?
Yes, which is fascinating. They utilized computational snow dynamics, algorithms that govern friction, cohesion, and stress release, some of which are used in sophisticated animation code, like the kind used to realistically model massive snowfalls in films. This allowed them to simulate the precise conditions of that weak layer, the depth hoar, failing under the rigid roof of the wind slab.
And the key was calculating the stress of those continuously loading katabatic winds.
Exactly. Imagine a sheet of heavy glass resting on a layer of fragile, crystallized sugar. The glass is held in place by the slight cohesion of the sugar layer and a few small support points. When the hikers made the cut to level the tent, they removed a support point. Then, the wind started slowly pouring concrete onto the glass. It didn't break instantly, but after hours, the concrete reached the critical weight, and the sugar layer beneath the glass failed silently.
So the tent was pitched at the precise point of maximum vulnerability, and their own action just accelerated a natural process that was already underway.
That's exactly right. The critical load, due to the slow, relentless accumulation of snow and the loss of support, was reached hours after they settled down. This explains why the final photos showed them cutting blocks and smiling. The mountain hadn't reached its breaking point yet. They were sleeping, vulnerable, when the silent collapse occurred, resulting in the instantaneous, blunt force crush injuries.
So to reiterate, the slab impact is the only unifying theory.
It is. It explains the simultaneous requirements of the forensic enigma. The car crash, internal injuries without external wounds because of the compression, the need to cut the tent from the inside because they were trapped, and the subsequent orderly retreat because they were making tactical survival efforts.
We can now tie all the evidence together, synthesizing the forensic facts, the diary entries, and the scientific reconstruction into a single, cohesive, albeit deeply tragic, narrative that is grounded in reality.
The sequence begins late on the night of February 1st. The massive, localized slab avalanche hits the tent, instantly injuring Zolotaryov, Dubinina, and Thibaut Brignol with crushing blunt force trauma, and it buries the laced-up entrance.
The emergency response is immediate and tactical.
The remaining uninjured group members cut their way out of the tent, prioritizing the injured and themselves over their equipment. They make that difficult tactical decision to retreat 1.5 kilometers down to the cedar tree, the nearest point of shelter, maintaining group cohesion to support the walking wounded.
And at the cedar tree, the initial survival struggle plays out.
It does. They try to build a fire using desperate means. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko die first, succumbing to hypothermia and exhaustion after stripping down to acquire branches and maintain that small fire. Their clothes are then scavenged by the survivors for insulation.
And then the final fatal split that demonstrates their loyalty to each other.
The group, freezing and realizing they are doomed without warm clothing, splits. The most severely injured, Zolotaryov and Dubinina, along with Kolovatov and Thibaut Brignol, retreat deeper into the ravine to dig a den for minimal protection against the wind and cold. Meanwhile, the most able-bodied Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin attempt the desperate suicidal climb back up the open freezing slope to retrieve the warm clothing from the tent. They freeze to death hundreds of meters from their goal.
So when the Soviet investigation concluded that the deaths were caused by a compelling natural force, they were fundamentally correct, even if they didn't fully understand the precise mechanics of the avalanche.
Absolutely. The compelling natural force was the brutal, indifferent power of the mountain combined with the laws of physics, specifically snow friction and slab mechanics. It was not a secret weapon, not a tribal attack, and not the result of panic from sound waves. The radiation was occupational cross-contamination. The missing soft tissue was environmental scavenging in the creek bed. The tragedy of Dyatlov Pass is a story of human error interacting with natural indifference to create a perfect, fatal outcome.
This deep dive took us from a sensational Cold War mystery right down to granular snow physics, using that 2021 model to unify all the disparate pieces of evidence. And what stands out most profoundly once the exotic theories are stripped away is the incredible loyalty displayed by this highly trained group.
Indeed. We see the horrific evidence of this loyalty in the forensic findings. The scavenging of clothes to help the injured, Kolovatov trying to keep Zolotaryov warm in the ravine, and the three others, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, making that final, fatal crawl back up the slope. They were sacrificing their diminishing chances, not for their own selfish survival, but to retrieve gear that might have saved the rest of the group.
The tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass is, I think, a masterclass in forensic complexity and how human error Dyatlov's choice of that exposed campsite can interact with silent natural forces to create a singular, devastating event. The ability to synthesize decades of conflicting reports and overlay it with a scientifically validated model gives us clarity, but maybe not comfort in the face of such immense loss.
I don't think there's any comfort to be found here.
No. So what does this all mean? The sources show the immense planning and preparation of these athletes. Despite their training for hundreds of kilometers in extreme cold, their final fatal error was a miscalculation of a geological process, a snow stability issue that their training simply didn't fully account for. The question for you to consider is this. In the face of nature's brutal indifference, does the intense human resilience and loyalty, like the group displayed in their final hours, diminish the tragedy? Or does it make the loss of these 9 talented young people even more profound?